First speaker, Professor Greely, is the professor of law and genetics at Stanford University. He chairs the California Advisory Committee on Human Stem Cell Research and the steering committee of the Stanford University Center for Biomedical Ethics, and he directs the Stanford Center for Law and the Biosciences, and also the Stanford Program in Neuroscience and Society. And this I didn't know until I read your life, which brings me this whole new set of ideas there. A lot of recognitions and important positions. His recent book is The End of Sex and the Future of Human Reproduction, recently translated into Italian, I learned. It was published just a few months ago by Harvard University. Very good. I read a lot.
Okay.
Or not.
Although, you don't need to see them on, I don't use slides.
Okay. Does it bother you that this is
No,
running?
okay.
Maybe it's
I've never been sure, actually,
Okay.
whether slides give me an allergic reaction that causes anaphylactic shock, or whether they're against my religion and damn me to hell. But either way, I never use slides. I'm happy to be here. I'm glad Piero mentioned my book, The Intersex and the Future of Human Reproduction. I particularly like the new Italian translation, which has a very sexy cover. Much, obviously Italian, much better cover than the English cover. And I love the name, La fine del sesso e il futuro della riproduzione umana. I commend it to you. Maybe the prose is better for the translator than it was for me. Despite the ominous title of the book, its strongest prediction, and the book is fundamentally a set of predictions about what's likely to happen in 20 to 40 years. Its strongest prediction is that in 20 to 40 years, people will still have sex. They will have sex for almost all. Well, you may not have sex. I don't know what you do now. They'll have sex for almost all the reasons that people have sex now, the good, the bad, the ugly, etc. But far fewer of them will have sex for the purpose of conceiving children. The core prediction of the book is that in 20 to 40 years, most people with good health care anywhere in the world, so everybody in rich countries, most people in middle-income countries, rich people in poor countries, when they decide to have children, they will not do it in bed or in the backseat of a car, unless they're teenagers, but instead they will go to a clinic. The man will usually provide sperm the old-fashioned way. The woman, instead of going through egg harvest, will provide some skin cells, a 2-millimeter punch biopsy, just takes a Band-Aid to cover it, that will then be transformed into what are called induced pluripotent stem cells, cells that can become every cell type in the human body, and then turn into one of those cell types, the one that we call eggs. People will make roughly 100 embryos. Each of those embryos will have its whole genome sequenced, so that everything that genetics can tell prospective parents about those future children, which is less than you might think, but is still a non-trivial amount, will be known to them in advance, and then they will be asked, which ones do you want to try to transfer to make into babies? What I want to do in my very brief time today is tell you a little bit about the science that leads me to think this is going to happen, and then spend a fair amount of time on the social, political, economic forces that make me think this is not just a crazed dream or nightmare, and end with raising 5 sets of ethical issues that I think this technology will lead to. So first, for almost the entirety of our history as a species, we've conceived babies in one way and one way only. But that began to change about 130 years ago with the first case, the first decently documented case of artificial insemination. 40 years ago this July, the first in vitro fertilized baby was born, Louise Brown, in England. And since then, there have been about 8 million babies born through in vitro fertilization, none of whom were born through an act of sexual reproduction. One of the things you can do with in vitro fertilization is called PreImplantation genetic diagnosis. How many of you have heard of PreImplantation genetic diagnosis, or is it sometimes known as PGD? So maybe a fifth of you? That's more than I usually get. When I describe this, people think it's science fiction, but the oldest baby born as a result of PGD could be finishing her medical residency now. 1990, 28 years ago, the first child was born as a result of PGD. What you do with PGD is take usually it used to be a 3-day embryo, now it's more often a 5-day embryo, and you take one cell if it's a 3-day embryo, one of the 8, and a handful of cells if it's a 5-day embryo, off that embryo, and you do genetic tests on it. And you decide, is this embryo going to get Huntington's disease if it becomes a baby and an adult? Is it going to have cystic fibrosis? Is it a good donor for an older sibling with leukemia who needs a bone marrow transplant? Is it a boy? Is it a girl? PGD has been around for a long time. It's had 2 problems. The biggest problem has been to do PGD, you have to do IVF, in vitro fertilization. Because if you get pregnant the old-fashioned way, if you conceive the old-fashioned way, where is an embryo at day 3 through 5? Halfway down one of the 2 fallopian tubes. Good luck finding it. If you conceive through IVF, where is the embryo at day 3 to 5? It's in the petri dish you put it in. They do not crawl around, jump out, move, they're there. And that's a really important aspect because IVF is a pain. It's expensive, it's uncomfortable, and it's even risky. Now, the discomfort and the risk, I'm afraid, is unfairly distributed. Sperm harvest is actually generally neither uncomfortable nor risky, but egg harvest, which is 90% of the cost of IVF, is 99% of the discomfort, and pretty much 100% of the risk. About half of 1% of women who go through egg harvest in a given year end up hospitalized as a result. Every few years somebody dies. Several people a year will lose their future reproductive capacity as a result of it. It's, the risks of that are probably lower than the risks of getting badly injured by a mad bicyclist on Stanford campus. But they're not zero. The risk of sperm donation, pretty much zero. So IVF is not something people do just for the hell of it. They do it almost always because they're infertile and they need to, or they do it because there is a particular genetic disease in their family that they really want to avoid in the next generation. In addition, another problem with PGD in the past has been you could only look at 1 or 2 or a handful of genetic traits at a time. You could look to see boy or girl. You could look to see 3 copies of chromosome 21, Down syndrome, 2 copies of chromosome 21, normal-ish. You could look to see Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis. Things are changing in both directions. With IVF, we are now able to take skin cells and turn them into mature eggs and mature sperm and make healthy offspring, if you're a mouse. It's been done for over 5 years now by a group led by Mikanori Saito in the University of Kyoto. You may have seen just last week, he had another paper out, I think in Science, where he's done with humans. He's taken it from skin cells to not quite, but almost mature eggs. There's one step before mature eggs in the cascade of stem cells. Now, if you can make eggs from skin cells, it's a game changer. You lose 90% of the cost of IVF, you lose all of the discomfort and hassle of IVF, and furthermore, when you harvest eggs from a healthy woman, a woman who was healthy at least before she went through egg harvest, how many eggs do you get? Well, on average about 12 from a moderately aged woman, but the range is 0 to 25. If you make eggs from stem cell lines, how many eggs do you get? How many do you want? Hundreds, thousands, millions. So, making eggs from skin cells turns IVF into something much easier, and turns PGD into something I call easy PGD, because it's easy. But it doesn't end there. The flip side of that is the other, in a completely different area of biology, bioscience. So we've got stem cell research moving forward with turning these induced pluripotent stem cells into different cell types, including eggs and sperm. In a different world, we have genetics moving forward with cheap whole genome sequencing. The first whole human genome was sequenced arguably in 2000, 2001, 2003, depending on who you believe. It cost somewhere between $100 million and $3 billion, depending on which accounting principles you apply. No matter which ones you apply, it cost a lot. 5 years later, Steve Quake here at Stanford sequenced himself for $50,000. Now he cheated, he counted his postdoc and grad student time at 0. They may not be worth much, but they're worth more than 0. He would never get the work done without them, so they're worth a lot. Today, you can get your whole genome sequenced for about $1,000. To get a really good sequence, a clinically valid, a clinically useful sequence is more like $4,000 or $5,000. But the curve has declined faster than Moore's law curve for semiconductor, for computer memory. And so in 20 to 40 years, remember I'm giving myself 20 to 40 years. By the way, footnote, if you want to make a bold prediction, my advice is set the endpoint past your life expectancy. I might make 20, I'm not making 40, so I can never be proven wrong myself. In 20 to 40 years, whole genome sequencing is going to be cheap, which will mean, in my scenario, and this is a prediction, it's not I'm not making a normative comment about it, a couple who wants to have kids will go to a clinic, he'll give a sperm sample, she'll give a skin sample, they'll make eggs, they'll make, I say in the book, 100 embryos. Each of the embryos will get its whole genome sequenced. The parents will then be asked, what do you want to know about them? We can tell you 5 categories of things. Nasty early genetic diseases. There are about 6,000 of those known. Happily, each one is rare. But when you multiply rare times 6,000, you get not so rare. You get about 1 to 2% of births are children who have a serious disease that could have been predicted through a genetic scan. Later onset diseases, BRCA1 mutations, breast cancer, Lynch syndrome mutations, colon cancer, various Alzheimer's risk factors. Cosmetics. We know that things like hair color, skin color, eye color, height, nose shape, hair type, curly, straight, kinky, etc., are largely genetic. You look at a picture of my family reunion, you know that white hair is genetic. My kids know they're toast. My wife's hair is whiter than mine, except she started dyeing it purple. But my kids started getting white hair at 27. All these things, we don't know much about them yet. They're not simple. They're relatively complicated. And oddly enough, the National Institutes of Health has not considered white hair a disease. Or an enhancement, actually. I mean, it is a good thing. The silverback gorillas ruled the gorilla bands for a reason. It's the hair. So, we don't know much about cosmetics, but we will learn. And we know a lot of it is very, very genetic. Behavior. We know a little bit. We know there are associations between various genotypes and personality types, or mental illnesses, or sports ability, or math ability, or music ability, or whatever it means, intelligence. Certainly SAT scores. Now, none of these associations is very strong. The latest and greatest group, looking at hundreds and hundreds of variations, has said, we think we can explain 11% of the variation, which isn't very much. So, maybe a couple of IQ points. It'll get better. My own guess is it won't get that much better, because behavior is really complicated, because it involves brains. And brains are not just genes. Every experience changes your brain. If you remember tomorrow that you were here and heard me tonight, it is because I have physically changed your brain. So brains are complicated, but we'll be able to say a little bit. I think we'll be able to say, this embryo, this has a 60% of being in the top half, 60% chance of being in the top half in sports, music, math, whatever. This embryo has a 12% chance of being in the top 10%, which of course the parents will not think about the fact that means it has an 88% chance of not being in the top 10%. That'll be true. And then the last and the easiest, boy or girl. I think many parents will find this irresistible, because I think the killer app, so to speak, to use Silicon Valley jargon, is the health one. To avoid that 1 to 2% risk of having a child with a really serious early onset disease. And then to avoid the chance that your kid will have a higher risk of breast cancer or colon cancer or Alzheimer's like your grandmother or your grandfather. That'll be attractive to people. Some people will care about hair color. Other people will use it as a tiebreaker. Other people won't care about it at all. But I think more than half of people in 20 to 40 years will use this way to conceive their kids. Now, why? I've told you the main reason, but there are a couple of other things. IVF, fertility clinics, the most profitable part of American medicine. There are 500 of them. They have a good lobbying group. They have good advertising. They will push for this. Their current market is about 160,000 IVF attempts per year. If you could move to, say, 2 or 3 million, good market. Second, I think it will be free for parents. Now, nothing is ultimately completely free, but let's say, and predicting healthcare costs is completely insane, and doing it 20 to 40 years in advance is insane squared, but I did it in the book anyway. Let's say it's 10 grand per baby made this way. 100 babies is $1 million. How many births of babies with serious genetic diseases do you have to prevent to save $1 million? About 0.2. So it will make sense for the healthcare systems, both in terms of public health, but it's something that is perhaps more tangible, money, whether it's Kaiser or Aetna or Medicare or National Health Services in other countries, it will make sense to subsidize this and effectively make it free to parents. There will be political opposition. I don't think everyone will do this. I think there will always be people who resist for religious reasons or philosophical reasons or romantic reasons, or because they're teenagers and getting pregnant in the backseat of cars is what they do. But I think most people will probably choose this. Now, what are the issues? There are lots of issues. 5 big categories of issues. Ethical issues. The first, which many people don't recognize as an ethical issue, but I think is a profoundly ethical issue, is safety. It is not ethical to give people unreasonably unsafe stuff. And it's particularly not ethical to give them unreasonably unsafe babies. To do something that produces a disproportionate number of severely disabled infants would be an evil act. So one of the reasons I put this 20 to 40 years out, I think this is likely to get tried within 10 years, but I think there should be a decade of safety testing. We're actually seeing right now that with some of the IVF children, there is increasingly disturbing evidence that they have some vascular problems and some higher rates of hypertension and other cardiac issues. We don't know what they'll be like when they're 60 because the oldest is only 40. We didn't study them. They were patients. They weren't research subjects. We need to do better this next time and pay attention to safety. We also have to worry about coercion. Will there be governments that say you have to do this, or you can't do this, or you can only implant the embryos that predict to be in the top half of military ability, or math ability, or intelligence, or love for the dear leader? Now, there almost certainly will not be a gene for love for the dear leader, but there will almost certainly be dear leaders who think there is one. So the coercive issues, but it's not just governments. It could be insurance companies. Could be your in-laws. Oh, pick number 12. That looks like Uncle Morty. You know how much Uncle Morty loved you guys? Coercion comes in many forms. Third big issue, fairness. Certainly the economic issues raise a lot of fairness questions. I don't think they're as huge as some people think. I don't think this is a speciation event. The difference between easy PGD babies and regular babies will be significant, but not huge. I can't quantify it. My gut says it's 10 to 15% better health, which rich babies already have compared to poor babies, but adding another 10 to 15% is not a good thing. In rich countries or middle-income countries, almost everybody will be able to get this, but it'll be a long time before everybody in Paraguay or Laos or Burkina Faso is able to afford this. There will certainly be international disparities, as there are already with health issues. They're bad now. This could make it worse. But I think some of the more interesting equity issues, sex, for example, well, gender, boys and girls. What if too many people want boys? We've seen this in other parts of the world. This doesn't require abortion in this case. It requires just selection. What do we do then? Now, happily in the US, it looks like to the extent there is sex selection, it's pretty balanced, at least today. But who knows what would happen? And I think the knottiest, the hardest of the equity issues involves disability. Let's say you're a person with a genetic disability, and now EZ-PGD comes along, and no one else, almost no one else is ever going to be born with your disease again. That says first to you, you shouldn't have been born. You know, you're a mistake. But it also more concretely says, there's not going to be research on your disease. There's not going to be docs who know how to treat your disease. There's not going to be social support for your disease. That's a really hard problem, and we need to bend over backwards to make sure that this doesn't make the lives of disabled people worse. Fourth issue, family relations. Complicated, weird. One side of it, how would you feel if your parents knew your whole genome before you were born? I don't know how you'd feel. I've had students say, oh, that would be so invasive. That would so invade my privacy. And I've had others say, well, it means they chose me. They didn't just choose a random baby, they wanted me. Out of 100, they picked me. Is this a plus or a minus? I don't know. Families differ. Other weirder family aspects, and this I think, one of the reasons I think this is going to happen, this won't happen, the key step here is making eggs from skin cells. That won't be sold initially for genetic testing in EZ-PGD. That'll be sold to the millions of people around the world, the 1 or 2 million couples in the US who can't have genetic babies of their own because one of them doesn't make eggs or sperm. Accident, congenital problem, illness, mumps as a boy. And they'll be desperate for this, and that's a very politically attractive group. They're just people like us who desperately want to have kids, quote, of their own, close quote. And they can't, and this gives them the chance. Well, one of the main reasons for that is often women who are older, who had eggs but don't anymore. If you can take skin cells, theory, I mean, we'll have to see it proven out, but 80-year-old women could have viable eggs. So could 8-year-old girls. So could 8-day-old babies. So could 8-week-old fetuses. So could cell lines from women who've been dead for 8 years. Dolly was actually made from the cell line of a sheep that had been dead for 3 years. So that throws some weird stuff into family dynamics. And just one more. This would take another jump, but there are some plausible ways to think about taking skin cells from, say, Piero, and making them sperm, but also making them eggs. And taking skin cells from Margaret and making them eggs, but also making them sperm. Why would you want to do that? Well, if you're a gay or lesbian couple who wants to have genetically related kids, there's a pretty obvious answer. This gives you a chance to have kids that are genetically yours, which you cannot do now. There's also the weirder side of it, suggested by one of my colleagues, leading me to reflect that law professors are almost as wildly egocentric as biomedical scientists. He said, well, if we take my egg and my sperm, we make a mini-me. I call those unibabies and uniparents. They're not exactly clones, but they're close to it. I think you'd have to be crazy to want to do that, but it's a big world, and there are plenty of crazy people. So last ethical issue, the one that I think viscerally is most powerful, although personally, intellectually, I find it the least powerful. It's unnatural, it's against God's will, it's against Darwin's will, it's just wrong. I love hearing people who've flown across the country using PowerPoint with a microphone in a room with artificial light talk about things being unnatural. Our lives are unnatural. This is not my fur. Handsome fur though it be, it's not mine. These are not my eyes, although they effectively are. You got to tell me more than it's unnatural. You got to tell me why this unnaturalness is different from other unnaturalness. There will be people who in good faith have good reasons for that. I just don't think they're going to be a majority of the population, or anywhere close to it. And I'm okay with that. I don't think everybody should do this. I think people who want to do this should want to do this, should be able to do it, and people who don't shouldn't. I also do think every technology I know of can be used for good purposes or bad purposes, can be used in ways people hope is good purposes but turn out to have bad consequences. This is no exception. So I think we need to think about appropriate regulation to try to maximize the potential benefits and minimize the harms. That seems pretty hubristic, so I've sort of boiled that down to try to avoid catastrophes. And I think we can't avoid all the catastrophes, but I think it's manageable to try to avoid catastrophes. And so that's why I wrote this book. I think this is coming. The only prediction I'm absolutely confident of is it will not unfold exactly as I predicted. But genetics and reproduction are intertwined. They're going to be more intertwined. It's going to become a bigger deal. We need to be thinking about this now. And so let me end by charging you. You now know more about this than 99.999% of the world's population, and I might be able to add, having looked at my Amazon ranking, another 9 onto that. Most people have no idea this is coming. You do now. Pay attention to it. Read about it. Follow it. Talk about it. Argue about it. Talk about it with your kids. It's your grandkids who may be at stake. Or your own kids for some of you. For most of us, I think it's probably grandkids. This is important. It's really interesting. Thank you for your attention.